Okay, let's start by jumping right into the weird intellectual deep end for a couple minutes, see how it feels, and then we'll widen out to an introduction. What is God? I would say God is the imaginal agency of or poeticized intentional stance towards the proto semantic cluster of attributes that communicate degrees of validation into diverse ontological frameworks and justification systems. Validation is valuable. It increases the salience, experiential worth, biopsychological empowerment, and social utility of concepts, perceptions, and behavioral patterns. There are different styles of validation and different domains in which validations occur. There are enculturated mental linguistic frameworks, subconscious neurogenetic hierarchies, and the logic of physics. Those are examples of domains in which chunked networks of relational elements of participatory perception are experientially indexed along a gradient of justification up to and including maximal validation. When we register maximal validation relative to a moment, an object, an idea, or to the entire embodied and embedded field of cognition and perception, we can say that these things are participatorily divinized. Their potential divine nature is actualized or realized. And this is part of my view of deity as it pertains to a coherent, pluralist, multidisciplinary natural science cosmos. This abstract philosophical description describes something that is relevant to the circumstance of intersubjective and adaptive spiritual organisms who are symbolically active via justified systems of behavioral investment. What it does for these sapient organisms is that it underwrites the personal and collective operations of validation and evaluation and coordination within their various justification systems, while also enabling the overriding of those systems in transfiguring moments of surplus meaningfulness. And the plural field of justification systems for such a pertaining implies or implicitly describes a dynamic metasystemic or meta-justificatory framework that must take the complementarity of a multiplicity of paradigms into its care and also secure access to the psychological mutation connected to trans-justificatory enactments, all of which generate flexible but normative ethical requirements attuned to the contemporary and emerging world conditions that require us to proactively clarify and connect the God concept to the embodiment of healthy, meaningful empowerment for general human populations, regardless of their particular traditions and symbol codes, in tandem with the cultivation of mature, well informed, competent, and appropriately neurodivergent castes of religious specialists. So, the God being described in these terms is inherently complex, relational, reciprocal, intimate, quasi-teleological, hypernatural rather than supernatural, affectively excessive, trans-categorial, and explicitly connected to the notion of a strong transcendence with what I would call preeminent immanence. And none of that means anything unless we have the resourcing and challenge necessary to enter privately and or reciprocally into our psychophysiological God response mode, Ishta Bhakti Yoga, in which the circuit of the love of God, the love for God, and the love as God is temporarily but cumulatively a lived reality. Or something like that. And for the next 90 minutes, we're going to explore a variety of somethings like that from a variety of folks who put some time into thinking and or feeling about this whole God situation. Hi, I'm Layman Pascal. Welcome to the concluding session of the UTOK conference called Science, Wisdom, and God. An alternative name for this might have been the Final Frontier. What I mean by that is that in the end, any integrative, multi-layered, non-reductionistic, coherent pluralism, no matter how grounded it is in the natural sciences, will finally have to grapple with God. God is a kind of final frontier, not only because he, she, it, or they force upon us questions of teleology and ultimate conditions, and of a radical step beyond conventional categories of social reasoning, but also because the nature of the divine operates like a horizon, endlessly present but never surpassed, an ever present finality of becoming, never reached but contextualizing everything. And one interesting way to think about this kind of divinity is as the potency that contextualizes a world of intercontextuality. But this is very elaborate speech. We can also hunt for God in very everyday speech. As a species, we say things like, God bless you, God damn you, dear God, God is on our side. This is a God-forsaken wilderness. Do you believe in God? Are you one with God? God loves everyone. God hates fags and godless communists. Where are the God realizers? Oh my God and oh my goddess. Are these colloquial phrases pointing to something in common, or are they pointing to a divergent set of meanings? Or do they challenge the dichotomy between convergent and divergent? These are among the kinds of questions I think we should be exploring in new and innovative ways. In 1989, the film Star Trek V came out. The subtitle was The Final Frontier. In that movie, William Shatner, who plays the ironically heroic cosmocentric humanist starship Captain Kirk, is taken by a half-human messianic prophet to meet God on a planet at the center of the galaxy. God's giant bearded face and Caucasian skin and booming cosmic voice welcomes the travelers and gives them a few pieces of generic wisdom. But when he finds out they've arrived on a starship, he gets very interested. He keeps asking about it. He keeps wanting to get on it to spread his message and his power. And Captain Kirk is suspicious, and he angers this vast cosmic being by asking, why would God need a starship? That's a terrible Shatner, but you get the idea. Now, the question is, and I saw this movie when I was a kid, and the question stuck with me, why would God need a starship? Are we talking about something that's actually omnipotent and omnipresent, or something that's just bigger than human beings? Is God perfectly content, or does God have a compulsive, perhaps even obscene desire that he wishes to see actualized in the universe? Is this an invisible, all-embracing force of universal love and creativity, or a very particular, personalized, genderized, even racialized entity? Does God only actually function in a unique particular form, as the empowering symbol of a particular ethos, as the great imaginal eternalizer of the virtues of a particular people? Or is that approach an outdated regressive limitation on a concept that must ultimately be understood as a universal formless intimacy or even some nebulous notion of value itself? Or perhaps the ambiguity of this question is somehow intrinsic to the thought God itself. And again, these are the kinds of questions that I hope we begin to face today. We're going to hear from a few people who have impressions, intuitions, or formulations of what divinity might mean and what divinity might be able to do for us, specifically in a post-pluralistic meta-modern age of integrative relational and evolutionary knowledge. What is the theology of the fifth joint point? Where are the nascent priests and priestesses of the liminal age? What is God in a meta-modern sense? I'll be leading a retreat and ritual and social immersion space devoted to that theme in Vermont in May at Sky Meadow Lodge. So before I introduce each of these participants to give a bit of an overview about where they are in their intellectual, emotional, or spiritual relationship to God, science, and wisdom, I'm going to say a couple more words about my own perspective on God, a God for an age in which non-reductionistic but deeply naturalistic unified theories of knowledge are emerging to handle the technologically accelerated confusion of realities and disciplines. And first, I should probably make clear that when I invoke God, I am not invoking the question of theism versus atheism. The question of whether some particular inherited mythic deity is asserted, either phenomenologically or ontologically as real, or whether those assertions are denied, is a very small part of the constellation of structures, problems, and modes by which human beings have been and still are grappling with the divine. Spirituality and religion in general, and God in particular, are behavioral and existential concepts, not sociolinguistic habits whose assertion as cosmological facts offers access to the privileges of a populist trans-tribal membership group. That sort of phenomenon is an artifact, often a degenerate artifact, of one particular cultural style and is not generally applicable. You can behave as though God is a reality to which you and we have access while passionately articulating an atheist, non-theist, or polytheist viewpoint, just as you can act in a godless manner while strongly identifying with a religious community or set of supernatural assertions. In fact, our friend Alexander Bard has made atheos the God who is present as the absence of God, one of the four primary types of deity pertinent to his syntheological vision of the religious necessities of the emerging biodigital epoch. And I would say that as no God is one of the most important names of God, as we can demonstrate by saying things like, no God created the universe, and no God controls our destinies. This is not merely cute wordplay. It's a deep insight into the gap created between the class of assimilated behavioral structures as God and the class of merely verbal assertions and reactive social identities as God. The God who is present as God's absence, which is arguably pre-formatted in the Christian notions of a crucified God with an empty tomb, is one potential symbol for holding open an investigation into the radical plurality of styles through which access to divinity might be mediated in the era of knowledge to which UTOK refers. And I think we must be considering deeply multiple styles or types of God and the relations between these types. From the Vedic Trimurti to the Kabbalistic supernal triad, our species has been constantly rediscovering the need for a dynamic non-dual interweaving or perichoresis of multiple modes of deity. The modalities we have to investigate run the gamut from the most exotic visions of something like a second-person fractal holonic and holographic convergence divergence structure that virtually instantiates the leading-edge integration threshold whereby surplus coherence is organized into emergence and by which all monads are coordinated at all scales of the inner and outer cosmos, from that kind of a lofty vision right down to the simplest pre-linguistic, merely phatic and gestural implications, whereby one might try just a vaguely ascended potency to a collection of children who don't speak your language. God as grunt, God as hand sign, God as facial expression. What I'm trying to do by bringing this up is to prime us to think in terms of a complex range of communicative possibilities in our attempt to find those old or new patterns of apex interoperability, which are viable given the current conditions of knowledge and experience for a sapient hominid species within a biosphere and heliosphere. Okay, that's a lot. And it's still only a little bit of my take on God. But I want to turn this over to some souls who've been trying to combine their personal experiences, intuitions, and intellectual efforts around divinity with their intersubjective sensing of the needs of the world that is and is emerging. We'll get their introductory remarks now. After we've heard from everyone, I will begin to prompt with further discussion questions, and then we'll open up into queries and sharing from the audience. And then today, as our final frontier, the high priest of the elephant sun god, Greg Enriquez, will come in and make a few remarks to close the conference. So right now, I'd like to turn this over for an opening comment to Jeremy Johnson.
Thanks, Layman. It's great to be here. How long do we have? We got a couple minutes for this opening comment. Wondering.
You can take 5 to 10, whatever you need.
Great. Okay. I don't know if I'll need that long, but yeah, it's good to be here. This is such an interesting subject. I appreciated your opening, Layman. I feel a bit of a sense of excitement and a little bit of anxiety coming on after that wonderful introduction, that yogic stretch of different possibilities. So nevertheless, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, not specifically as God or the question of a belief in God, but it's something that's come up a lot in my own studies with Gebser and integral philosophy. And it's this, let's just sort of frame it for the moment as an impulse towards transcendence. And that's by stating that, I'm admitting this is the human impulse towards transcendence, right? This is our relationship with the perceived transcendent. And the interesting thing is that the secular world has really opened up a kind of clearing for many different views to be held about that relationship and to see each other having a relationship with the transcendent with different worldviews, right? So secularity has created a kind of space that affords this kind of acrobatic introduction as you just presented us with. It's a very interesting kind of clearing. And the transcendent, or the numinous, we may also call the meaningful, is often enough a kind of private affair in our lives, especially in the secular West at the very least. It's a personal one. And at best, when we reach a kind of a cultural zeitgeist, right, it might become a shared and a communal one. We might develop this into communities of faith. So what's missing, perhaps in this sense of the secular relationship with the divine or the transcendent, is an overarching world or worldview in which we as individuals are participating in. A multiplex, as the scholar Charles Taylor talks about or described, of various forms of the sacred, of sacred time, of sacred place, of varying degrees of spiritual encounters with different kinds of entities. We no longer live in that kind of world. That world has really withdrawn. And the sense of the sacred, the sense of the divine has become profoundly personalized, which is a very strange inversal of the way that most communities of faith and most sacred-oriented religious or traditional worldviews encountered the divine in. So we're already kind of swimming in an interesting context that's quite different. And in the West, we're faced with a kind of dual achievement here, right? It's an achievement, but it's also a crisis, this ascent into modernity and secularity, right? It has provided, as Charles Taylor talks about, these incalculable gains, the development of this new self, the buffered self, right? That's able to encounter the world in a secular context, encounter the autonomy of nature, and develop a sense of self-consciousness through that world, right? The buffered self. But we've also encountered these unacceptable losses that Taylor talks about. There's a kind of inherent tension in being modern, in that we are drawn towards the transcendent and the sacred, and yet we live in a world where it's ultimately nearly impossible to accept that the world out there is somehow, we're in some kind of sacred participation with it, right? There's been a clearing of that kind of world. So we're kind of in this dualism here, this tension, the human as two. The human is secular in the secular context, in an open world, and a relationship with the materialism and an autonomy of nature. But we're also yearning for a connection with the meaningful, with the numinous, with the transcendent. And so for me, it's a question of participation. How do we reconcile the zigzag of history? If we've developed a secular world and the experience of nature is this autonomous, if not a machine, then a quite infinite organism that is in the process of ever becoming its material, right? How do we successfully accomplish the zig with the zag, and where is the zag here? How do we turn towards the sacred in a way that's appropriate for us, not only as moderns, but also as beings that are oriented towards the transcendent and the numinous? How do we turn towards the sacred in an overtly secular context? Or the other way of flipping this into another question is, perhaps the secular world needs to undergo some kind of transformation. Can we turn towards the sacred and face what Charles Taylor called the barred door of the transcendent? And what happens when we do? I'm very interested in this barred door and breaking it down, perhaps kicking it down, perhaps flipping over it, perhaps rendering it transparent, and the ways in which our worldview can encounter the sacred, not on the terms of the secular, not on the terms of the modern, but on new terms. I'm not saying simply going back into tradition, but what are the new terms? And I think this is a really interesting question and very curious to hear all of us exploring today. In my own work, I'm not interested in merely adapting the sacred into the definitions of the secular or the modern or even the postmodern, right, which remains still very much highly secular. Instead, I'm compelled to a more difficult and challenging work here, where in turning towards the sacred, our own worldview is ultimately challenged and potentially transformed. How do we approach the transcendent or the numinous on new terms, right? Terms which both satisfy the spirit of scientific inquiry and empiricism and satisfy that overall immanental frame that we convey and are embedded in, but go further. The step beyond the barred door would be the step to go further, to challenge us to reframe what we actually mean by immanent and transcendent, what we actually mean by matter and space and the material. Do we even understand that? Spinoza's question, right? We do not know what the body is even capable of, that Deleuze really loved. I think in order to do this, we have to cultivate a rather equanimous attitude towards transcendent experience, religious experience, tradition. We must remain radically agnostic and open to it in ways that will challenge us and only in doing this do I think we can actually encounter the new terrains, right? Which opens up new thought. Because when we bring the sacred and the transcendent into dialogue with sacred traditions and the religious imagination, when we let them actually dialogue with each other and not merely collapse or co-opt each other, right? That's a difficult thing. How do we actually remain equanimous here at this edge of the thinkable? Then I think something interesting occurs, something more meta perhaps is happening here, a meta turn. And meta, by that, I mean not necessarily meta modern. I refrain from the uses of the modern part, but I love the word meta because it means through, above, between, under, right? It derives from that older term etymologically, metaxy. So when we're really kind of in that swarm of worldviews, when we bring these worldviews into a meaningful exchange and bear that unbearable and awkward tension of being in the middle, the true metaxy, then I think something interesting might happen. Both might transform into something wildly new. And I think there are many interesting examples of where this might go, especially with respect to, say, indigenous worldviews and traditions, engaging in a kind of cosmological weaving with scientific knowledge and post-colonial political activity. I think, the kinship mind, as Tyson Yunkaporta describes it, and the empirical mind of science coming together does create something genuinely new. What that is, I think we still need to explore. And I think there's some excellent work being done here in various philosophical traditions that have already been thinking about these interrelationships fairly early on, really since the beginning or the advent of the scientific revolution. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Romantic philosophers, the poet empiricist Goethe, right? Of course, or Friedrich Schelling's proto-process thinking, right? These greater explorations of this relationship between nature and mind, and why and how nature produces thinking, imagining, dreaming creatures such as ourselves. And of course, I'm also thinking about these other great Western thinkers, of course, right, who have developed philosophies of becoming, from Henri Bergson to Gilles Deleuze, both of whom actually left some room for mysticism, even though they were thinking mysticism in radically immanent frames. They're squaring the circle of the transcendent with the immanent, which again is a sort of interesting place of metaxy in our thinking. I'm also thinking of Alfred North Whitehead's work, Teilhard de Chardin's, and a little bit closer to home, of course, Jean Gebster, who, like Owen Barfield, suggested a kind of participatory turn, right? Where exactly living dialogue with previous worldviews in the long history of consciousness, the transcendental in relationship with the magic and mythic, that kind of place of metaxy is where something integrative begins to emerge. So if we can actually have an authentic dialogue, something interesting beyond the modern worldview might come about. Gebster specifically developed a phenomenology of consciousness, or a phenomenology of the present, or presence, really, that argued for a kind of spiritual praxis in the present, in and with the present, as the way we might go about doing this, achieving this renewed participation with the spiritual. Gebster suggested that in the history of religion, in the modern age, we're much closer to the contemporary definition of religion, which is a binding back, right? A tying back to modes of consciousness that we're no longer seated within or at the locus point of anymore. We have to enter these altered states to kind of remind ourselves of that relationship. And Gebster's pointing out that, in the long history of consciousness, there may have been a time where we were much more participatory with the numinous and the sacred in day-to-day life. It may have had a much more agential relationship with us if we think back into animism or forms of polytheism. As we move into the contemporary age, that dynamic relationship sort of atrophies, and we reorient towards spatial thinking and the secular context, the secular world that we're in today. But for Gebster, there needs to be another turn beyond religio, beyond binding back. And he suggests playfully that it is a preligio, an obligation or a turning towards an intensified present, right? Where we enter into a relationship with the living past, what Bergson would call the integrative past and a virtual future, right? Both in the creative, intensified present, a present of becoming. So in order to participate in calling in the future, right, and therefore participating in a kind of cosmic creativity, this might be a way of describing what the poet Mallarme called a new form of worship, a creative becoming with the present, right? But such a new worship would not turn away from the scientific or the material perspectives. It would weave them into a more complex tapestry of these differing modes of participation in the present. And there's more to say, but this might be a good place to pause for now. I'm just sort of dovetailing this with a sense of, we're talking about, or at least I'm talking about and exploring, a participatory spirituality that could be anchored in the present and a creative weaving of different worldviews, past and future. And if there is a transcendent, a God, it is not a God of being nor of becoming alone, but a God of the creative, the being of becoming, the God of the may be, as the French philosopher Meillassoux writes about, a God which we might find in the diaphanous present. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. A Gebserian God of participatory metaxy that picks up where Charles Taylor leaves off. I'd love to hear Jermaine Marvel tell us how he's standing before the theological question.
Hello, everybody. I'll just do a brief introduction to myself, because a lot of you might not be aware of who I am. Then I'll go on into how I came to my understandings and relationships with what we call the divine. And hopefully that will all fit into 10 minutes. So I predominantly am an artist. I'm a rapper, for lack of a better term, but mainly a lyricist, a vocalist, writer, poet. I perform with jazz musicians. We do live improvised work, and so I see this as a bit of a live improvised work and life as such as well. So I like to think it transcends. Why that part fits today is because I call it my spiritual warfare training and musical therapy. It happens weekly in London, and it's been a lifeblood for me and a lot of other people. The group's called Steam Down. If you're ever in London, you want to check us out. Apart from that, I'm also a facilitator. I run workshops. I run workshops with people of all ages. My preferred ages are between 16 and 25. Specifically for young people who have come from difficult walks of life, whether that's youth offending service or young people who are in danger of becoming institutionalized, whether through the Criminal Justice Act here in the UK or through the Mental Health Act here in the UK. So everything I do has a mental health outlook to it, of which I work on the principle that the 3 pillars of mental health are expression, resilience, and agency, and they all combine together to provide well-being. And my key go-to workshop style is, I call it future motives. It's a bit of a play on words of young people's slang and that. A motive is a party for the young people. I say young people because I'm 36, so I feel like I'm a bit, starting to lose track of their slang. But basically, I help them work out where they've been, where they want to go, and how they're going to get there, and what can help them and what might get in the way. Most of the time, they teach me stuff and they inspire each other, and I just facilitate their conversations. Outside of those 2 things, through bereavements from a young age, continuing into adulthood, I questioned God. I was raised Christian by a mother who would always tell me about all different types of things, including Rasta. I'm not actually a Rastafarian, or I should say I am a Rastafarian, but I'm also Christian, and I'm also Muslim, and I'm also Buddhist, and I'm also Taoist. That would probably, and I'm also slightly atheist. That would probably give you a better understanding of what my personal spirituality is, and how I've got to where I am. I would engage. Well, after a couple of bereavements, I sort of just think, okay, God doesn't exist. And so I started investing in atheism and had some conversations with friends around that. And then I had a lot of conversations online in groups with atheists and theists. And there would be the constant back and forth arguments. And I just didn't appreciate how theists would ignore science and how atheists would ignore the reality that humans have needed theism in order to get to where we are today. There's not a society which hasn't invested some way within God, even if that's shunning God. And so the anti-theistic tendencies just didn't really sit well with me. And, going back and forth in internet arguments, you know how it goes. It's not very productive, and I started to get tired of it. And so I got a bit creative with it. And I asked myself, where are the places where theism and atheism align? What do they agree on? I know what they disagree on, but what do they agree on? And how could they be similar? It led me to a very strange place, which is nothing and nothingness. I don't think I need the word ontological at that point, but I want to trace things right back to the beginning. And I realized that this concept of nothingness that we have kind of brings theism and atheism together. We could say nothing is supernatural. Nothing exists. There is nothing outside of existence. And that would kind of tie in with the idea of a God as nothing, of God as this thing before time, before existence, before space. And so in that being, everything else must come from that nothing. And this idea then I read a bit about Octavia Butler and her earth seed and her God of change. And it struck me that kind of resonated as well. I don't know if you know Octavia Butler's God of change, but basically Octavia Butler says God shapes change, we shape change, God shapes us, change shapes us. And it's about taking responsibility of the only constant that there is, which is change. And I found myself asking the question, what does change look like to us? Not on the surface level, but underneath. And I found it to be very similar to a concept of nothing, which led me, you can read it if you want, but it just led me to a long paper on just exploring nothing and really what it is, and coming to the idea that most of the things that we call nothing aren't actually nothing. They're more of a meta nothing, something that's beyond nothing, which appears like nothing to us, which kind of preempts time, space, and existence. And this led me to, try and trace, okay, so how can everything unfold from this matter nothing, or this matter existence? And it led me to see that from this change comes what we call existence. And that existence as a singular processual event, for instance. And when another event occurs that we can define as separate, it leads to a concept of time. And when another event occurs, which is kind of separate, it leads to a concept of space, and everything unfolds from this. And I thought, okay, this is okay. You can kind of incorporate physics here, that's cool. But it didn't really lead me anywhere. Not anywhere where I could have a conversation with someone. And it helped me understand certain religions, but not all of them. And so, And I started looking into metamodernism as something that was beyond. I just started conceptualizations of the world as it is today, and how there was a sense of both and. There's also a sense of oscillation, which is, I'm not going to go into it today, but there's a sense of both and, which comes from metamodernism. And I found that if you combined atheism and theism, you could come up with a sense of metatheism, which is using religion as a metaphor and atheism as a metaphor. There's only one other thing, so this is kind of disparate, but there's only one other thing that I would like to mention just as a thing to throw out there and as a concept. And that is, have I got time? Have I got time, Layman? That is the idea of the self as God, which comes from the nation, the 5% nation of gods on earth, which is an outspringing of the nation of Islam, which more of you might be aware of. But basically, it's quite popular in hip hop, and they have the idea that man is God, that somehow we are God. And I just wanted to, I'm trying to understand that really and just unravel that. And how could I unravel that and bring that together? This kind of what seems like a narcissistic tendency for me. How could I be God? And they have this thing which is known as knowledge of self. And it's when you really know your true self and you become God. So what is our true self? And it struck me, and it's just a thought, it's just an interesting thought, that if the pantheistic aspect of spirituality has any validity whatsoever, what would humans represent in that? And how could we say that we are God? And it struck me that if we took the idea of humanity throughout all of time as a collective, and we look at what we're able to do and what we have been able to do, then that is a entity that has godlike powers, identify far into the future. And it made me think, what if the past religions and their idea of God was something that was resonated from within us? And what would it look like if we treated humanity as a whole as a deity? And so, yeah, those are two very extreme. One, God as nothing, and the space in between everything as God. And on the other hand, the whole of humanity and what the whole of humanity represents to the universe as God, and the span in between that and where those two things. Those are my perhaps incoherent ramblings on spirituality. But I come here from mainly what has been known as a Black meta-modernist understanding. So I'm trying to avoid some of the erudite elocutions and get down to the nitty-gritty. And at the same time, I'm trying to keep everything I know about this informed from a perspective of the Southern Hemisphere as well, so that it doesn't just apply to the people who are lucky enough to understand this at the higher levels, like us, and we can kind of integrate it into a wider field. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Okay, a rambling Black meta-modernist polydoctrinal exploration of how theism and atheism align in a God of change as something like the negated negation of a processual both and meta-nothing with hip-hop adjacent deification of humanity per se. What have you got for us, Alexander Love?
Hey, everybody. Lovely to be here with you. What's occurring to me as I was listening to everyone so far, I was reminded of, in the Tao Te Ching, they say that the Tao that can be named isn't the Tao, which throws us into a bit of a conundrum here. And there's been an invitation or an evocation of the possibility for God to be a participatory God. And so what it brings up for me is an invitation for all of us, that if there is any truth to there being something existent that cannot be named, it may be, in fact, something we all need to rest into here right now together. Because there's 70 or so of us on this call, which means that there is something that is inquiring about the nature of something. And my invitation to all of us is for us to drop into the quality of what is it that is inquiring here about the subject that we are inquiring about. What is it that is inquiring? And how do we taste that? How do we taste that here? So that perhaps we can live in the inquiry as we're inquiring to see what that might, what sort of flowers might burst from that. And that leads me into this question. Germaine mentioned true nature. Sometimes I like to use some Chinese characters because they offer some symbolism that can be quite supportive to not the mind of thinking inquiry, but the way in which symbols evoke the artist to dream about, that then thrusts us into touching something in the immediacy of the moment. One of the ways that you can draw true nature, the true part, it shows a tree with roots, and then there's an emphasis on the roots. Root nature, the ground nature. When I lean into that, I have the experience of a luminous presence of being. A luminous presence of being that seems to be outside of time, seems to be outside of space, seems to be unshakable in its presence, seems to have no boundary. And there seems to be a kind of a luminescence, a luminosity that has a little bit of a leaning in, sort of like a rising omnipresent flame that's somehow at the same time a nothing that isn't nothing. A crystal clearness that doesn't have a location yet is everywhere and seems to have some kind of knowing. Not knowing as in the presence of apprehending knowledge and information, but a sense of beingness that is knowing, that is both everywhere and nowhere all at once. And so then we then could look at the character for spirit. I'm going to put it in the chat just so you have a little thing to reference. And what we have is these two images. The image on the right, in its earliest oracle bone depiction, was a lightning bolt. The earliest known rendition of this character was a human being struck by lightning. So we have this, on the right side of the character, we have this implication of light that is descending and making impact. A thunderous roar that sort of thrusts us into the numinous, thrusts us into something beyond our current sense of norms, our current sense of reality. On the other side, the other part of the symbol, what you have is a single line that's representing heaven, and then you have something that's descending from heaven. You could think of it, sometimes it's talked about as the sun, the moon, and the stars. But if we take that a little further, we can hold this as an implication of luminous fruits that are hanging from heaven. Because that top line represents unity. It's a single stroke upon the canvas. There is no divisionality. There is no break in continuity. And then yet from that unbreakable continuity, that ground, that root nature, comes these luminous fruits. And the beauty of fruits is that while at once they fall from the sky, within them contain seeds that fall down to the ground and then become a possibility within diversity, within the realms of proliferation. We might call the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things, the innumerable things, the frothing, the pontificating, the confetti popping, the cakes, the bad days, the stones and the pebbles and the wind and all of these things. These are all the 10,000 things. So with this character, we have this recognition of this striking of light in such a way that some sort of potentiality begins to unfold as seeds becoming sprouts, becoming blooms. And so then what we have is still this one taste, this ground of being, but now this ground of being is experiencing itself through proliferation, through the many. And this is where we get into the sympoiesis, this becoming together. I don't know if you're familiar with the word, maybe you are, sympoiesis, but if you misspell sympoetic, if you misspell it just perfectly, it means making poetry together. And sympoiesis is this process of this intermingling, this interweaving, as I think Jeremy was mentioning, where now these luminous fruits have grown fingers and toes and proclivities and desires, so that we have this capacity to interact with one another or to interact with ourself as this one. As this one. And so then it brings us into this possibility of this notion of centers and peripheries. We often think of ourselves as a center and everything else is out there. Jaap van der Wal, this wild man of a majestic human being, he's an embryologist. And he was talking about how when the embryo is forming, you have what becomes the baby, and then you have what becomes the sac, the placental nourishment and the sac that is around the baby. And we tend to think of it as the baby is the main event, and the sac is this sort of secondary thing that we, get later. And we put the baby in the sac, and then that's how it grows. But what Jaap points out is that the baby, the center, and the periphery are co-born. The center and the periphery is one organism, and they're growing together. And then Jaap asks this powerful question. Well, what happens when we're born and the placenta and the amniotic sac burst and are taken away? He's like, well, then what becomes of our placenta? And of course, then points out that everything in the world around us then becomes our new placenta, our new place of nourishment, our around. But when we keep that imagery of the center and periphery growing as one organism, then in this very moment, you are each your own center, and we are all each other's periphery, as this one luminous ground that is discovering itself through each of us. And this is further This is further given, there's a symbol that helps us further here when we look at the character for destiny. Now, sometimes people will look at this character as fate, but we're going to look at it in terms of destiny. And what you'll see is there's a little triangle at the top. This triangle at the top is basically the number 3. It's showing the unity of heaven, human, and earth. So it's implying that there is a unification of these fruits as they fall down to earth. And then as for the last 14 billion years, they have been frothing and growing and entangling as the one taste. That then eventually grows itself self-reflectivity where we can look back upon ourselves and say, what the hell is this? Then underneath that, what we have on the left side is we have a mouth. Sometimes this is, if you want to translate this in a traditional way, you could translate it as the Lord's command, right? So you see in the beginning of the Bible, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And you have that kind of languaging. But the invitation here is that there is a command as a creative energy, as a creative dynamism, the fruits that are falling and then rushing back upward towards the sun and proliferating as they do so. But now, on the right side of the characters, notice that little P. This is like a stamp. But if we look at this, there's another character that shows basically this P and then a backwards P. And the symbolism here is that the emperor or the empress would have a piece of jade. And they would break the piece of jade, and they would hold one piece of the jade, and then they would give the other piece of jade to the person who's working on their behalf. So that now this person can go out in the world and they can say, well, I have this thing that has come from the emperor or the empress, which means I am holding the authority of that creative force. Now, when we look at this notion of nature, true nature, the invitation here is that broken piece of jade. One piece is that ground of being. And that other piece we hold at the depths of our soul. So that if we were to turn inwards, and this would be, of course, the discovery of ever-increasing depths of wisdom, if we were to go towards our essentials, who are we? Continuing to deepen and continuing to plumb those depths, we would find the quality of that broken piece of jade and realize that there was only one taste. That in our reflectivity, which has given us innumerable experiences of suffering, innumerable experiences of ecstasy, there's this recognition of unification of one taste that was always present, where that piece, in quotes, of my soul and that piece of that ground of being and its desire to discover itself through a great play has always been one. And its features are naturally curious, interested, and infinitely loving and compassionate. And so then as we access that's what naturally overflows. And it's what pours into the world. And the pouring of that into the world becomes a nurturing of all dimensions of this one being, to be able to discover its own piece of the whole in its own unique way so that it can unfurl and flower and blossom. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
That was lovely, Pastor. Thank you. Who is the one who inquires into the unspeakable participatory God, and how do we live into the phenomenology of that in the immediate dream of this very moment, into a beingness that is also a knowingness, in the symbol of how we are commanded to be struck and electrified by our apprehension of the self-overflowing and descending potentiality of making poetry together in a center that is also a periphery. Okay. That's already a lot, but maybe Benita Roy can bring this all home for us.
This is a wonderful person to follow. Thank you, Alexander. Because had I not recently become ambitious, I would have just resonated. I wouldn't even have tried to say what you said, because I also am very much aligned with that. I'm a Taoist and or Chan Buddhist, and spent many years in the Taoist community. And I have horses and live on a farm. But my ambition here is my frustration that the beauty that you just spoke falls on deaf ears in our society. And so I've tried to, I've tasked myself with trying to bridge modernity, the monotheistic religions, and scientism in a way that directs people toward the wisdom of your experience. So I say this as a caveat because nothing I'm going to say is improving what you say. So let me start my, and then you'll hear some of the things I say really echoing Jeremy, because I'm going to talk about Whitehead and Gebser. So my ambition is to do that and gesture toward that in a kind of modern metaphysics way. Okay, so we have this guy, Jordan Peterson. He's writing a book and going on a tour. And the title of the book is We Who Wrestle with God. I find this very interesting because people invent God and then we wrestle with them, right? So this notion of modern people wrestling with God, and now we have to talk about God and the religion that's not a religion and get back to, because we created our own problems. And what Alexander was describing is what David Hinton describes as the Paleolithic mindset. This is what he talks about, the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. They lived with a profound and complex emotional world that is absent in us. Their lives depended on killing individual beings they recognized as kindred, as sisters or brothers, or ancestors, or more accurately, as past future forms of themselves. And that could only elicit an intense feeling of grief for the killing and gratitude for the sacrifice that allowed their lives to continue. Grief and reverent gratitude, and a loving commitment to harm the least possible of that intensely kindred and precious world. All of that infused with a celebration of belonging to a vast and mysterious tissue that extended far beyond their own existence, a celebration in which they relished the moment-to-moment beauty of it all. So one of the things that I want to start with is that we're here in our modern world, grasping for questions to these existential problems of belonging, of meaning. And it seems that these are modern-made problems. As far as I can see, they're problems that we invented in the axial age. So we can't go back to the axial age, but one of the things I want to really land is that there's something that is inherently given to us that's already what we're looking for. Okay, so the Paleolithic people are the cave painters. They didn't construe themselves in terms of existential angst or, we have these shocks of existence that Tarnas calls, and then Copernicus, gave us the shock of existence that the earth was no longer the center of the universe. But of course, Paleolithic people did not think the earth was the center of the universe. And then you get Descartes, giving us the shock that we have subject and objectivity are two substances. But Paleolithic people didn't think this. So we create these false models, and then we're shocked when we realize that these things aren't true. So there's something odd going on here. What did Paleolithic people have? They had a sense of awe, wonder, and mystery, a sense of kinship with the earth, a sense of the earth's role in the cosmos and the 10,000 things. They had a sense of ancestry, continuity, belonging, and they had a sense of a personal God or personal gods, that the animals and the divine were kindred. Okay, so you see with Christianity, we make a big deal. We have Christ. Now we have reinvented the personal God. But what I'm saying is we reinvented it in time because we lost that a long time ago. This is very important to understand. We also, with Christianity and Christ, reinvent the notion of consuming, having to consume our kindred. So the sacrament of communion, is a reinventio of the Paleolithic conundrum of both sanctity and gratitude for the food that you're eating. They had an idea of transmogrification. If I eat the lion becomes human. If the human eats me, the lion eats me, I become human. So what you see in Christianity, the pivot toward Christ, is in a sense very much a pivot towards some of the primordial Paleolithic reverence that we have. So these are interesting. I just want people to know that, like, this stuff, we're reclaiming something that was originally there. So my question becomes, so I was asking myself, so why did Paleolithic people have this, and why do we have to reinvent it? Why are we struggling with it? And so this is where Gebser comes in, because Gebser said Paleolithic people were atemporal, timeless and spatial. And I think you heard Jeremy say this. So they inhabited this long now, like everything was already existence and already happening in this long present, this presence, this continual presence. And we as moderns live in lineal time, and we spatialize it, right? So there's the past is over here, the present's over here, and the future is over here. And we parse God into these three frames. We ask, what is the source of the universe? That's the past God. God is source. God is origin. God is creator. This is even what the scientists are asking. They say, what is the beginning of the universe? And then we say, what is the future God? So this is, the Holy Ghost or the apocalypse, or it's transhumanism or posthumanism, or it's evolutionary spirituality. And the problem we have there is that we think everything of religious or spiritual or evolutionary significance happens on our branch of the tree. And then we're caught somewhere here into in with the present. And so I thought, what if we take Whiteheadian process philosophy? But Whitehead didn't take a Gebser's approach. He still is talking about past events being enfolded into subsequent events. And I'm saying, what if we look at God as people have a certain duration of time. We can open our minds to a conscious moment, and we see a past, and then it bleeds into the present, and it's latent in the future. But what if we look at God or the universe or the whole shebang as a very, very long duration? So that, for example, we don't look and say, well, this, the Big Bang happened over here, and then this happened, and this happened, but that we are the Big Bang happening. Or that it's not like the stars in the galaxy did their thing, and then that became animals, and animals became us. But the animals are the galaxies happening, and we are the animals happening. I mean, this deep continuity, if you don't start, take these three different lenses, you can see that there's just one propagation, one eternal propagation that's been happening. And I'll give you a little sense of how this goes. It gets very complex. I'm writing a book. And that is, if you just think of this question, is the first amoeba still alive? There's a sense you would answer yes. In a sense, you would answer no. Okay? And to me, this wave of propagation is like that. The once God is alive and enfolded in the latent potential of all the other amoebas, right? There's nothing lost and nothing gained. But if you look for the amoeba, the first amoeba, you're not going to find it. But that's because you've taken this posture of past, present, future. So we have to inhabit. I'm suggesting that we inhabit. And so I end up talking about waves of durations that propagate along with this larger propagation. And that these waves then are, we could say, initial radiance. You could call it the first inflationary moment, same that physics says. But if you want to make it religious, it's a radiance, a propagating radiance. And we can't locate it in time because we're not doing the past, present, and future. And this radiance, this wave of propagation is still, these words are difficult, is radiating now. And then you have these radiant events that grow. So initially, this is where I'm trying to resonate it with science. Initially, this radiant propagation, at first the wave is resonance. Okay, so you have waves or subatomic field events that either constructively or deconstructively interfere. So this is the first resonance. So the resonance, and all of these have latent and potentials, because the next stage is latent in the resonance, and the potential at this stage is resonance. So you have resonance. This is the first propagational wave. You have constructive or deconstructive interference in a chaotic environment. And this results, what's latent in this, results in the production of order. So the universe becomes negentropic. There are negentropic causal relations. So you get autocatalytic sets, et cetera, et cetera. You get the topology of process relations if you've read my article. So this is the production of order. Above a certain threshold, there's more constructive than deconstructive resonance. And this is the propagation of order. And then you get sentience, which is a positive or negative valence oscillations in an ordered environment. So if you think of a motile protozoan, just feeling it's oscillating. Oh, I don't want to go there. Oh, I want to go there. Oh, that feels good. This would not be possible if the environment was not previously ordered. It would just die out, okay? So now resonance is required for sentience. And so sentience is positive and negative valence. So now you get this value sphere coming in an ordered environment results in feeling. And then, and feeling, and so you get cognizance. Cognizance is the feeling state. And you get, so these waves are propagating, they're not chopped up in time. There's just this, all these are still being propagated by the resonance, which is propagated by the radiance. Cognizance is the successful or unsuccessful or satisfying or not satisfying outcomes in predicated environments. So now you have arousal states which are predicating, an animal is hungry, so they're predicating that there's food here. And they start to build more efficient pathways toward food. And this is you start to see there's much more value-laden quality to this this propagation waves. It's starting to suck in and intensify value. The next, but latent in that is pushing out the consciousness. So we have predictive processing in simulated novel environments. Rats can do this, and the higher animals, and many the corvid birds. So consciousness is predictive processing in simulated novel environments, what Michael Levin calls the ability to solve problems by different means. Okay, and simulated novel environments that the agent builds, umwelts, and now we're at the point where you're creating a conscious feedback loop between the agent and the arena, which I call the habitas and the habitat. So now, there's this whole process topology I'm not going to get into. And then the next wave is reflexive consciousness. And this is the ability to simulate yourself. And as far as we know, this is actually the only thing that other animals can't do. So you can simulate yourself inside a simulated environment. And we have the ability to incept simulated realities directly into the minds of other people. Okay, now this is a potential bottleneck, okay, at this point, like this propagation, because, you know, along this story I'm telling, there are things that propagate, you know, little side propagations, and they're not helpful. And so we're here at this stage where I could argue that some of the simulated self in a simulated environment has some benefit, but when it starts to simulate AI and all these, I think this is in the wrong direction. So now I'm going to say, what is the direction that I think of wisdom? And so we go from, instead of going just from reflexive consciousness and not getting to the next larger or the next more powerful or potent radiance, the next wave, I think, is, I would call receptive awareness, which is being able to perceive the fundamental reality of the world in a context of the whole and the universe in the context of deep time, exiting the simulation and discovering the causal manifold of reality. So you see the living center, which is this propagation. You see it as real. So you're kind of exiting the whole seduction of simulation, even though those have benefits as they come along. And that's receptive awareness. But you're still have this sense that, you know, you're receiving from, you know, there's all kinds of literature on this, but you're receiving from a field. The next step is open awareness, that time and divine reality become transparent, a la Gebser. And the constitution of the new human becomes possible through grace, consciousness, and pure luminosity. So these are big words. And I'll just quote what Diana Fascia, who's one of Greg's favorite psychotherapists, she calls this the core state, a state of openness and contact wherein individuals are deeply in touch with essential aspects of their own experience. Experience is intense, deeply felt, unequivocal, and declarative. Sensation is heightened, imagery is vivid, focus and concentration are effortless. The effective marker for core state is the truth sense, an aesthetic experience of rightness. So this is what I would say is the field of open awareness. And then I would say there's one last transformation, and that is, and there's some great quotes I have about this in the book, is the sense of now you realize that all you are radiance. You yourself are the same as the initial wave of propagational radiance. And I think this, you know, I did this presentation this way because it kind of lines up with UTOK, and I know this is about UTOK, so I was happy to add that with an alternative for ontological stack. Yeah, so thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bonnie. I see that we have about 20 minutes left. So instead of prompting with my questions, I'm just going to tell everybody what my prompt questions were, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from all the people who are here. So I was going to ask everyone, all the participants, which, if any, experiences they've had in their lives that their brain automatically reached for the idea of God to describe. I was going to ask whether they feel like it's essential to describe God as a primary condition of reality, or whether it's adequate to describe it as something that's co-enacted in moments in which we experience God. Does God have to have been there all along, or is divinity something you produce along the way? I was going to ask about the relationship between divinity, complexity, and ecology, because there are ways of describing God that seem to be thwarted by nature and complexity, and there are ways of describing God that make it the poeticized essence of nature and complexity. And I was going to ask about this interesting tension that exists between the slightly butchered Dostoevsky quote that if there is no God, everything is permitted, and the Slavoj Žižek quote that if there is a God, everything is permitted. And what's the more ethically fraught and problematic situation for a civilization, to be in the open clearing of angst and multiplicity around God, or to be holding some fixed symbol of the big other as the instantiation of our experiences of divinity? Which one is more likely to make us into better people? Which one puts us in greater moral danger? So those were my 4 question prompts, and maybe they'll seep into the background here, but if anyone here wants to ask a question of anybody in particular or of the group in general, raise your digital hand and let's go at it. Zach Schlosser, go ahead, man.
Got it. Now you can hear me. This is a question for Bonnie. So can you say more about the distinction between the simulation, the furthest reaches of the simulation today, AI, and this alternative move into the future? I'm hearing you say we're starting with receptive awareness. I think you're on the edge of saying that the simulation came with benefits, but also that these two modes seem to be mutually exclusive. Are they mutually exclusive? Could they be mutually supportive?
Yeah. So, so I'm going to just resort to regular past, present, and future language now, because sticking with that frame, that larger frame, is really hard. So when we look at what things that I said, like if we look at Greg's stack or my sentience, cognizance, and stuff like that, these are the waves that persist. And in the meantime, there's all kinds of things that get subtracted from the present, subtracted from the moment. So there's animal forms that we no longer see, that went extinct. And so there may have been something between sentience and cognizance that we can't see, because when we are doing this is one of the principles in the book, is when you look into the past, much of what is happening gets subtracted. And so you just have these kind of more punctuation points. And so what I'm saying is that I believe that line that goes from simulated environments to simulated novel environments to simulated self, which we still have, to digital. So there's a danger to get very, very lost in the simulation. And I believe that is going to my story is that's going to die out. And from, years from now, we'll be saying, and then there was open receptive awareness, and no one will have remembered that AI was doing this thing, right? So do you see what I'm saying? So and this is because I think, because there are people who are writing about receptive awareness and open awareness and self-luminosity. And I think these are the leading edges of these future propagations, and that AI is just one of these malforms that are technically basically not interesting from this value sphere. So now, having said that, it could be part of or a road or a path to receptive awareness, but nobody's talking about AI like that. So I don't see that. I find it from this perspective of deep time. I find AI and a lot of the stuff that we're all hyped about as not very interesting, not very important. There's certainly not as important as the move from sentience to cognizance to consciousness. I just think those are at a scale much greater than the move from humans to computational AI. Thanks for the question.
Can I offer a unusual look at AI as it pertains to gods? The binary system, I've read somewhere that it was inspired by sound divination, which is basically lines and dashes within the sound. A bit like the easiest way I can probably describe it to you is the yin yang. The I Ching, and the way that I Ching has have a line for 1 and a dash for 0. And that's interesting to me because I look at technology as potentially tools of divination, and technology as computer technology as potential tools of divination, and technology itself as an extension of the human. We just extend ourselves using our technology. Fire for light, so eyes. Zoom for eyes and ears. It's just one way to look at it, because I know it's very scary for a lot of people, and I wrote a paper on this, and there are ways to use it in different ways. If we look at it as an extension of ourselves and just as tools, and potentially a tool for divination to find out more, do more self-exploration.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a tension in these kinds of discussions going forward around the notion of the syntheos idea, of something like divinity that we bring forward in the world, and that some people will be leaning towards how that's done through technological and systemic instantiations, as Alexander Bard does with the term syntheos, and other people will be leaning sort of strongly away from that into a more deep time and naturalistic approach that views that as a bit of a cul-de-sac. So that'll be an interesting interplay. Just wanted to say that I see Oliver Griebel's here, and he's got an anthology about theology coming out very shortly. Shout out to Oliver. Does anyone else have a question or prompt they'd like to hear any of our participants address?
We solved everything, Layman. It was
Beautiful.
That's it.
Beautiful.
Perfect panel.
Teamwork.
I maybe have a simple one. I'm not dressed to turn on my video, but I'm wondering which aspect of this conference would you point towards as the divine? If we really try to ground it in the phenomenological, in the experience we shared, maybe in this moment and in this community of people gathered, which aspect of our shared experience unfolding in this moment would you point to as some aspect of the divine?
All of it.
Yeah, I was going to say all of it as well. I was like, well, if you listen to Alexander, we're always making with in the present. To what degree of intensity can we perceive that? Or as Gebster says, where that, like how much can we withstand a perception of the present? Because the present is creativity. The present is enactment. The present is participation. Maybe a cop-out way to get out of that, but it's all divine. It's all creative.
I think this kind of speaks to Layman's prompt question of whether God is primary or co-enacted. I I mean, you're probably expecting this, Layman, but most of your either or prompts, I would say, is both. I think, yes, all of it, because it's primary. And then also this bit where we're relating and we're trying to, we're talking about and we're trying to discover what is this thing that is divine. And that co-enacted aspect of it, I feel like that enhances our perception of the primary. And so, it kind of uncovers what is already there and helps us just to sit in the moment with it.
Sigurd, you've got your hand up.
Good. Get that. So I'm wondering, what kind of gongs can we find to wake people up out of their slumber and realize that the world of Facebook and Instagram and X, known as Twitter, is not really the world that's more connected with that central spirit, let's say?
What I find is the best technology to do that is suffering, which happens on its own. And in the work that I do with people, that's the primary instigator. Where, there was a question in the chat too about, related to wisdom, and it seems like it's those places of agony, the screaming that comes from forgetting what we might be, and forgetting to lean into what we're becoming as it's happening in the moment. It leads to such pain that I think we're brought to our knees, and with luck, with grace, with all sorts of different ways, we manage to find someone who's helping. And those means of helping show up in so many different ways, so many different places, even just from, us, a crying 8-year-old having their hand held by another 8-year-old, that there are these ways in which that technology of suffering, it says, I can't stand this as it is anymore. And then it begs us to search until we find some way to find. And actually that ends up coming back to that notion of destiny, as not as the attainment of a destination, but of a flash of recognition that piece of jade inside of me is the piece of jade that is the thing that, I am what I've been looking for, kind of thing. Yeah. That's what comes up for me.
What that says to me is to learn not to run away from every discomfort.
Yeah, exactly. It's the turning towards it. And I think that's the path of wisdom. Because whenever in my experience of having pain in my life, lots of it, turning towards that, it's that it leads to that diaphanous awakening, where we're seeing the pain, but then we see through the pain into what's actually underneath it, and then something blooms there.
For me, one of the gongs is a kind of our value system needs to change a little bit. What the gong is to get that change, I don't know. And just an interesting side note: the 5%ers, as they are called sometimes, like to see wisdom as the application of knowledge. So if everything is divine, the knowledge that we can have, the knowledge that everything is divine, but then to put that into practice would be wisdom. And then understanding for them would be seeing where to put that into practice, into what degrees.
I just wanted to
I would
throw
say
in
suffering, art, drugs, ritual, deity, yoga, and trustworthy ecstatic exemplars. And what would you add, Jeremy?
I love that list. I first thing that came to mind is taken more from Henri Bergson's work, but I think it applies to Gebser because of Gebser's radical notion of time in the present, time as being a relational present, like a living present, that the past is alive in us and the future is alive in us as a sort of virtual creativity. Bergson's way of engaging with this sort of creative duration is what he calls a phenomenology of hesitation. And Deleuze really likes this term. He says, in the phenomenology of hesitation, we gain freedom, consciousness, creativity. And Byung-Chul Han, who's another philosopher, I love a particular line he has on the notion of hesitation, where he says, when we hesitate, when the hand hesitates to encounter the world, right? When our perception hesitates to see the thing as ready-made for us, the hand acquires a vastness. So when the hand hesitates, it acquires a vastness. So I think we need phenomenologies of hesitation, right? Which disrupt the ready-made, which actually allows us to encounter time in the present in a radically different way, a living way.
Nice. Phenomenologies of hesitation. Brandon Norgard, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks. This reminds me that the question just before this one about values, and say what's most sacred. How do we evaluate that? So yesterday there was a session on religion, and I saw some people. One of the presenters seemed to be saying, "Okay, what seems to be most sacred?" Without saying, as many words. It was more like he was kind of alluding to like what he wanted to find most sacred was the life. To put it into UTOK terms, I also found it seemed another presenter wanted to look at, okay, what's most salient to us is the mind and the culture we're in. And that's where the most meaning and the most sanctity could be found. And then another presenter was looking at, okay, where are we going? What's emerging? What is this, working toward this omega point as, the fifth joint point. So I did put into the chat the people at that time didn't get around to that question, but can you really say that all of these planes on the TOK system are equally valued? Can you maybe, I know I have to figure, on the basis of the answers you guys provided to the previous question, that would be where a lot of you guys would want to go with this. Like, it's all valuable, it's all sacred equally, But could there be a different approach to that? So I'm a little bit not quite buying that everybody wants to equally value all of these planes and all of the different ways of approaching value and sacredness in reality, in life.
I think one of the things is that our hierarchies are very spatialized. So you can only visualize it something higher than the other. If we look at the idea that space might come from time, and someone said in the chat, the expansion of the universe as ever present now, then we can try and move our hierarchies from spatialized to temporalized, and then you can see that one is more valued because it's foundational, and one is more valued because it's later on, and so it provides a different output. And at the same time, they're kind of equal, but they're also not equal because one is needed before the other one in time frame. Yeah, that's just one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say it in a different way. That's because when you stack one way, you're only looking at actuals. It doesn't make sense to say, well, let's just get rid of the animals and just have humans, because you would then get rid of everything in your animal nature and you would no longer exist. So you can't value the human more than the animal. It doesn't make any sense. So you can't say, well, so your question isn't a framework. That's extremely narrow values sphere, because you're only valuing one subset. Your measuring stick is very, very narrow. It's a full question. It's an illusory question. It doesn't make any sense to value those stacks in that way. And in fact, if you really look at it, all value spheres are incommensurable. And that gets into a whole nother thing, but it's a mistake to think that values can be adjudicated. This is something Hartshorne thought a long time about, that all values exist in relational spheres. So yeah, it's a a kind of question that is easily debunked and should fade away soon because it doesn't make much sense.
I just want to give one example of highlighting why like stage or dimension hierarchies aren't really what they seem to us. There's a model that I've I was alluding to earlier. And when I look at it, the way things evolve over time, we have to have existence first, then you need to have time, then time produces space, and the concept of space, I'm not going to go into it now. Space produces the three dimensions of space, and space would lead to light, light would lead to gravity, gravity would lead to the electromagnetic force, the electromagnetic force would lead to the strong nuclear force, and that would lead to the weak nuclear force. Now, we can disagree that that's accurate, but if we just hold that framework in our head and say, okay, this is one way that that these forces and these forces emerge through time, we can say, okay, does that mean that the weak nuclear force is higher or more valuable than existence itself? Or does that mean that existence itself is higher or more valuable than the strong nuclear force because they're all needed for coexistence? I think that's what integral second tier is trying to get us to understanding. But as I said, and Gebza kind of points to this as well, our spatialization is kind of just crushing us.
Okay, last question, Adriana.
I think it was more a reflection of what's happening for me listening to this panel than a question, but I'd love just to when Jeremy was talking about the inhabiting the present more fully or something. I'm sorry if I'm paraphrasing it wrong from Gebza, but listening to all of you, it feels to me like I can see the placenta that is all of us holding us all, informing me and how much I can see more of reality through these different perspectives, and how the fact that, for example, Bonnie, the way that she frames things for some people might feel upside down, and to me feels so natural. It's only the upside down because she's countering the main narrative of society. So all of this allows me to see further, and I wouldn't be able to if it wasn't for this, all these frames. So this coexisting, this co-doing that we need to, I don't know. It was just a reflection of how beautiful it is. I can see further because of these new frames that were given to me just now. So,
Thank you. Okay. Well, obviously the most pertinent questions around God, science, and wisdom have not necessarily been addressed, but we may have opened some general sense of the overlap and common resonance between people who are exploring these questions at the so-called level of coherent, pluralist, and unified knowledge. And we've invoked the divine placenta, and I want to give a shout out to Jim Rutt for sitting through this. And maybe Greg wants to come in and touch on God and wrap up the conference for us.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for an enlightening, enriching, broadening final session. It's been moving, and I wanted this session, first off, my dear friend Layman, who opened this exactly in a layman-esque sort of way and got me in the groove right off the bat. I want to first thank you and make a point that this we're ending this, and Brendan's in the audience, with the idea of a bridging and a networking and a connection and an extended collective intelligence as we think about the next thing or a next thing in this corner of the internet to show up at Sky Meta Retreat and to have a retreat, a meta-modern spirituality retreat on the concept of God. So I thought that was if we think about relationality and connection and one many across all sorts of different dimensions, that's at least a symbol of that. I also want to share a little bit about kind of where UTOK is and why I wanted to end with this panel also. So I emphasize UTOK as endo-naturalism at times. And what I'm inviting for us to think about that is to consider we need the natural world. Philosophy and the science around the natural world has not been well aligned. And I, hold up the problem of psychology, the problem of psychotherapy, the problem of the psyche as saying that's poorly aligned. I believe we can get a better grip on that. And then, of course, where does that sit? I am not a fundamentalist or a foundationalist. I think it was mentioned in terms of somebody who was talking about agnosticism and even Gnosticism and some tension in relation. To me, as we grip a better endo-natural picture, it's then in what relation is that encapsulated? And that's why I find ourselves in the concept of God. For me, the sort of a simple notion of the concept of God is found in the notion of the infinite real and the notion of the infinite transcendence. And that shows up in many different ways in UTOK, but the simplest and most concrete it has to do with sort of the theory of the week that we have. Masi and I sort of generated and it was replicated, and I share that. I shared it in the beginning. I'll share it again. So Monday's void darkness day, death, the source, emptiness, destruction, entropy, and out of which then light, energy, information emerges on Tuesday, out of which the material object dimension on Wednesday, living organisms, minded animals on Friday, today's culture person day, tomorrow God moon day. And then, of course, the universe dies again. And it's to me, feeling that layers has both, there is a stacking, and I would want to say there's a stacking at some level. We wouldn't kill a child in the same way we'd kill a cow. So there's some kind of stacking. And at the same time, there's a repetitive inclusiveness. There's an embedded, embodied oneness, and that one many stacking, the resonance, the infinite now, all of those things are beautiful concepts, and I think super important concepts for us to wrestle with as we sort of expand and hold a naturalism in one way, hold a scientific analysis in another way, and expand out to the potentialities. I love what each of you said. They resonated with my spiritual core. I've had a couple of transcendent experiences, what I sometimes label as wisdom energy, and just felt in line with so much of what was said in relationship to that. So I deeply appreciate this sort of high and broad and rich spiritual reflection coming at the end of the conference. As we wrap up, I want to thank everyone who participated, folks, gave their time and attention as participants. We had over 60 presenters, many of them from Brazil. We had presenters, my dear friends, one presentation after another. I felt, speaking for myself, was very moving. I deeply appreciated the time. I felt the community grow and deepen into so many different ideas. I look forward to watching the videos of things that I didn't see. I want to thank my team one last time, the UTOK team, Andrew Robinson behind the UTOK team square there. What a beautiful coordinating act to sit this together. All the beautiful graphics. Christian Gross, if you're around, man, that guy puts together some really cool graphics. Martin Chitnelin, keeping us moving, task-oriented, helping us, and then showing up and participating. Masi Agralia, my love, and somebody who really now has seeded UTOK in Brazil, and of course, obviously brought a quarter of the presentations from that, and to see the international bridge, see the language, which I'm so bad at, but to watch the language this be talked about in Portuguese, it warms my heart. And so from my vantage point, folks, this has been lovely. I want you to know there is a little gathering, a little UTOK pub that will start at 5 for anybody who wants to kind of hang out, have a beer. I know Andrew will be there. I'll be there. I really, really appreciate the richness of the ideas, the sophistication of the ideas, the good spirit that is brought here. It's been tremendously fulfilling for me at my core. It's been tremendously stimulating, and the relationality that I'm feeling is just genuinely lovely. I deeply appreciate this. We'll continue. We'll pass the baton over the Meta-Modern Spirituality Retreat. We'll kind of get, and we'll be in touch about kinds of things that's coming for the UTOK future. We saw that the book is going to be coming. There's going to be a website, and we're going to be really kind of consolidating UTOK Society, and I really look forward to that. So with that, as we get to 4:45, I think we're bringing it to a close. So thank you so much, Layman, for that. And thank you all participants. It really was a joy and very meaningful. So thank you, folks. Definitely appreciate it.